Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure and privilege to have this opportunity to speak at the IFANS. I am particularly grateful to the president of IFANS, Ambassador Shin Dong-ik. Before becoming the North Korean Human Rights Ambassador, I served for 3 years as Human Rights Ambassador, and while doing that, President Shin was at the Home Ministry in charge of UN and human rights affairs. So he provided great guidance in my work in trying to put the human rights component as an integral part of Korea's foreign policy, and I think we have done that. Since we have a number of students here in the audience, I just want to give a very brief overview of human rights as it trended in the 20th century. Of course, the concept has been around for a very long time, but I think really the way the international community has adopted human rights as a very important component of international politics started during and after World War II. If you remember FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his State of the Union address, he spoke of the 4 freedoms, the 4 freedoms speech: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Okay? So he's already talking about the importance of thinking about the human rights and how human atrocities ought to be prevented. Then the war came to an end in 1945, and the world was shocked to find out things about what happened in places like Treblinka, Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and the massacre of a race, 6 million Jews, the gas chamber stories. These were just unheard of, and the more stories that came out, the more appalled and averse the international community became, and the UN and the international community came together to say that no more. These sort of human atrocities cannot be repeated. It must, by all means, be prevented. That's where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comes in 1948. Also, we have the advent of the international conventions on the civil and political rights, as well as the economic, social, and cultural rights, which come into play in 1966, but becoming effective since 1976. So all of this put together become what is called the International Bill of Human Rights. And equipped with these sort of ideas and international laws, the international community starts tackling international human rights violations, of course beginning with the Nuremberg trial, and we also have the Tokyo Tribunal, but it goes on. And we've seen this in 1993 when we had the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. We've had similar tribunal for the genocide in Rwanda. We have the extraordinary chamber in the court of Cambodia. You remember the killing fields, the Khmer Rouge, the Pol Pot regime in 2003. So lots of things are happening and lots of ideas and new attempts to deal with human atrocities being conducted by the United Nations and the international community as a whole. One country that's probably one of the worst violators of human rights somehow is able to fly under the radar of these UN mechanisms and international law, and that's North Korea. And North Korea is a country that violates every single one of the 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think you may have heard of the COI report, the UN Commission of Inquiry reports, which I think you can go into the High Commissioner for Human Rights site, and you can readily have available some of the findings and recommendations of the COI. But it talks about the political prison camps. We still have political prison camps in North Korea, and we're talking about as many as 150,000. We're not talking about a prison of some, say, 500 or 1,000 prisoners. We're talking about a town, okay, where everyone who is born into that town are prisoners of these political prison camps. They're still run by, you probably heard of the Yodok Story musical. Yeah, that's part of the North Korean prison camps. We have political purging, which it's still going on. Jang Sung-taek is a primary example of purging, political purging. But we've seen that during Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and his father, Kim Il-sung. There's no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, information. You cannot travel freely. You cannot work in places that you want to. There's no freedom in residence. You can't just say that I want to live in Pyongyang and you can live in Pyongyang. No, that just doesn't happen. Okay? You are just put to where the state tells you to be resident, to be having your residence. There's discrimination based on birth. By birth, you're discriminated. Women, handicapped, are all discriminated against. There's public execution still going on. You know about public execution. They make have like audience watch executions take place, and they will put on the front row family members to watch the public execution of your father or mother or brother or sister. There's torture, forced abortion, infanticide, systematic rape, slave labor. Particularly nowadays, of course, the big issue is the overseas workers of North Korea who work in places like Poland, Malta, of course, Russia, China, and they're forced to work, and their salary has been taken away. That's slave labor, right? So this is really becoming a major issue in the international community. Now, the United Nations, of course, especially since 2003, has, particularly the UN Human Rights Council, have adopted resolutions to deal with the North Korean human rights violations. In 2004, it even appointed a special rapporteur for North Korean human rights. It began with Viti Muntaborn, and then it transferred over to the Marzuki Darusman. And now, from this year, is Thomas Quintana from Argentina. Okay? The General Assembly, the UN General Assembly in New York, have also adopted resolutions every year since 2005, and it continues. But still no change, no improvement. And therefore, in 2013, the Human Rights Council in Geneva said that, okay, we have to do more. That's how the COI came about. And it investigated for 1 year the situations in North Korea, but of course they don't have access into that country. This is probably the most closed society in the world. And therefore, much of their findings depended on the testimonies and data from the victims themselves. And now, as you know, November this year, we have gone over the 30,000 North Korean defector mark. In South Korea, we have now over 30,000 North Korean defectors. Okay, so through their testimonies, they came up with what is called the COI report, which came out in February 2014. And it was a sea change. some of the key points that the COI report made. I mean, it's a very thick book, but I will just give you a very important key points. Number one, crimes against humanity is being committed in North Korea. Now, crimes against humanity is one of the four most serious crimes in international law. It's on par with genocide, if you will. And the COI report recommended that the Security Council of the United Nations refer North Korean situation to the ICC, International Criminal Court, that the perpetrators, those who are violating, including Kim Jong-un, ought to be prosecuted. North Korean situation is very, very unique. Usually, human rights violations of this magnitude occurs where there are civil wars, civil strifes. Do we have civil war in North Korea? No, we don't. And yet, we've had 3 generations, 70 years, of systematic human rights violation, which makes North Korean situation very unique. There is no internal civil strife, and yet you have such huge human rights issue at hand. The COI report also called out on China to abide by the non-refoulement principle, which means that, of course, we've had the refugee issues. We have many refugees who are seeking for political asylum in China. Okay, they're crossing over Amnokgang and then Dumangang, the Yellow River, into China. They don't get to come to South Korea or to England or Canada right away. Okay? They dwell in China for a certain period of time. But if they're caught by the Chinese authorities, they're forcibly sent back because they're regarded as illegal aliens. And when they're sent back, they're persecuted. Right? So the COI report told China that it's illegal to do that they should not be returned to North Korea. Michael Kirby, a justice from Australia, talked of the horror in North Korea in his investigations on level with Holocaust. He actually drew some comparisons that there is no parallel. It's unparalleled in contemporary world. I'm not saying that. These are the words of the international, very highly respected justices and human rights lawyers talking about the situation in North Korea as such. Now, when the COI report came out and when the findings and the recommendations were reflected in the UN General Assembly resolution, North Korea started moving. And this is really interesting also because you know that North Korea, because of its nuclear tests and missile launches, there are a number of UN Security Council sanctions resolutions. But North Korea does not budge. Okay, you do whatever you want. I'm just going to go our way. It just doesn't move. And yet, when this human rights issue came up at the UN, North Korea really started acting sensitive. Right? For example, Lee Soo-young, North Korean foreign minister, came to the General Assembly for the first time in 15 years. There were 3 Americans who were held in North Korea. I think you may have heard of like Kenneth Bae, Jeffrey Fowles, 3 of them. They just released them. Okay, no conditions attached, which is very rare for North Korea. They are always trying to bargain something, get something out of this. This is what is called the quote-unquote charm offensive of North Korea. North Korea is trying to charm, we're not so bad, right? So they even invited Special Rapporteur Darusman to North Korea on condition that could you please take out that ICC referral part in the resolution? Could you leave out the North Korean leadership part, right? Then, if you do, I will invite you to North Korea. North Korea also ratified a convention on the right of child. They hadn't done that for 23 years, and they did so. So the international community was very encouraged. We found possibly an Achilles heel in North Korea. This is something that actually moves North Korea. The international community, not just the UN, very active in dealing with this issue, especially with the COI report coming out. The Canadian government, for example, in September 2013, declared September 28th as the North Korean Human Rights Day. This is the central government of Canada doing that. Very famous law firm in London by the name of Hogan Lovells. It's a global law firm, pro bono. They did a further investigation into the North Korean situation and came up with a 100-page report saying that it's not just crimes against humanity, but genocide is also being committed in North Korea. US, very active. US Congress, you may have heard of HR 757. It's a congressional bill, sanctions measure. The US State Department this year in June came up with a sanctions measure which included Kim Jung-hoon. His name is included as a sanctions target, which is very unusual. In South Korea also, you know that we've had the North Korean Human Rights Act, which was held in abeyance for about 11 years. And then this year, it passed. So we now have at the Ministry of Justice a repository, a records office, very similar to Salzgitter in West Germany before the German unification. Okay? In the unification ministry, we also have a North Korean Human Rights Center. It will soon also have a foundation that provides support to human rights activities. And of course, it called for the establishment of a new position, the ambassadorship for North Korean human rights, which I have assumed as a result. Well, North Korean charm offensive didn't last very long because I think we all know that this year North Korea's had 2 nuclear tests and 23 missile launches. And this is, the general estimate is that for these 2 nuclear tests and 23 missile launches, it probably cost about $200 million US. And that's quite amazing because you know that North Korea's had this flood issue in Hamgyong province, right? And then when that happened, North Korean government started asking the international global community, asking for humanitarian aid. We need flood relief. You know that the 5th nuclear test took place after the flood had actually taken place. So the problem is, if you provide aid to flood relief, the international community has a dilemma because then it could be indirectly supporting North Korea's continuation of these weapons of mass destruction programs. This is a huge problem for the international community as a whole, and it's not going to be solved easily. We have 2 main problems when it comes to North Korea. One, nuclear weapons. Okay? The other, human rights violations. It's going to be very difficult because both these are tools for the regime. It's the most important tools for the regime survival. Okay? Nuclear weapons, because Kim Jong-un knows, like his father, Kim Jong-il, also knew that he knows what happens to totalitarian dictators without nuclear weapons. Ceausescu, Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Noriega, list goes on. So they want to continue with the way of their rule, and they don't want any outside interference. And how to prevent outside interference? Nuclear weapons. Nobody can touch us. That's why it's so difficult. It's going to be very, very difficult to convince North Korea just to pat them on the back. That's why the six-party talk has gone nowhere. Human rights violation is similar. It's for the internal use. It wants to make sure, the regime wants to make sure that there's no challenge whatsoever to the regime. And how do you do that? Well, you make sure that it never rises up. Okay? Any sort of anti-state voice just cut off at the very beginning. How do you do that? By stamping on and quelling any sort of rights that are inalienable, considered inalienable in a normal state. China, of course, holds the key. But unfortunately, China continues to consider North Korea as a buffer state in its Cold War-like calculus and mentality. The only positive sign is that in the Chinese, the netizens, the younger people in China, for example, when the 13, I think you may have heard of the 13 North Korean restaurant workers who defected from China, they're now in South Korea, right? Chinese government allowed that to happen. And if you read some of the Chinese responses, Chinese everyday youngsters responding, for example, the Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, and also Baidu, the Chinese version of Google, they're all saying positive things. That, oh, our government did the right thing to let them go. Great, congratulations. Others saying that, oh, geez, I feel sorry for the family members left behind, right? So they know exactly what's going on. So we're hoping that the public opinion in China changes to the point where it will start affecting the Chinese government in its dealings with the North Korean human rights issue, which could be reflected in the Security Council. Unfortunately, North China has a veto power, and that's precisely the reason why the COI recommendation that the North Korean situation be referred by the Security Council to the ICC is not happening at this juncture. So I was given, I think, 15 minutes, so I think we will have sort of a Q&A session. I will leave it at that. I will just encourage that there's nothing too small that you can do in joining the global campaign to address the North Korean human rights issue. You can bring defectors. We have 30,000 of them to speak at the IFANS. You can have some sort of a pictures gallery. Some of the defectors are former artists. They continue to draw. They have exhibitions. We now even have defector rap singers who just performed recently in Brooklyn, New York. Yeah. So there are many things that you can do. You can write, as young students, you can write to the Secretary General of the United Nations. You can write to the High Commissioner, expressing your concerns. If you know some celebrity friends, tell him or her to join this cause, to raise the issue and put the pressure on the regime so that we can have even just a little bit of improvement in the human rights conditions of our own people in the North. Thank you.